Hello, everyone, from wherever you're joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have quite a lot of people registered for this webinar today. Welcome. My name is Caro Kriel. I'm the Chief Executive of Thomson Foundation, and we are an organization that supports media and trusted information. And we work globally around the world. And a lot of our work currently is focused on disinformation and AI. Thus, the topic for today's discussion, disinformation and AI, and what we've learned from elections in 2024 so far. A bit of housekeeping first. I'm going to introduce our fantastic panelists shortly. We'll be talking for 40 minutes between the four of us, and then we will be taking 20 minutes of questions. You'll see there's a Q&A box. Please fill it with questions and comments as we go along, and at the end of it, we will get to those. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Joining us from Taipei is Professor Chen-Ling, who is a professor at National Taiwan University, who is an expert in journalism ethics. And good evening, Chen-Ling, joining us from Taipei. Joining us from the United States is Jiore Craig, who's Director and Resident Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. She is a real expert on democracy globally and the wider impact of online harms on society. She has extensive experience working with elected officials, civil society, on how to mitigate the impact of disinformation on public opinion and elections. Welcome, Jiore. And finally, an old Thomson friend joining us from Bratislava, Slovakia, Rasto Kuzel, and I hope I got the pronunciation correct and got the Slovak pronunciation, Rasto. Rasto leads Memo 98, which is a media monitoring organization, and he has 2 decades of experience delivering analysis and technical assistance to international organizations, especially around elections and issues of online disinformation and harm, and how to tackle the negative impacts of this. So you probably know, if you're joining this webinar, that this is a very big election here globally. 2 billion people are voting. And for us at Thomson, we're very interested to see how disinformation is impacted by this relatively new phenomenon of generative AI. We know that AI has been around for a long time, but the world has woken up to it with the birth of ChatGPT. And we were very interested to see especially where this all will go in terms of elections this year. So we commissioned a case study in Taiwan, which is one of the main big global elections, and it actually took place in January this year. And the study was undertaken by Professor Chen-Ling and colleagues in Taiwan, specifically to look at how generative AI has influenced that election. Of course, the Taiwanese election was won by the DPP, a pro-sovereign party in Taiwan, a result which angered Beijing, which sees Taiwan as part of China. And this is where I want to start our discussion. Chen-Ling, one of the reasons I was specifically interested in Taiwan is because Taiwan is not a country that is immune to disinformation or is new to seeing disinformation during your election campaigns. You had instances of disinformation in the 2020 election. But now in 2024, what are your conclusions after doing this research about the new challenges regarding the influence of generative AI on disinformation?
Thank you, Caro. First of all, it has been a pleasure for me and the Taiwan Communication Association to work with the Thomson Foundation on the report regarding AI disinformation during Taiwan's presidential election, which was held on January 13 this year. And since year 2016, global democracy has been threatened by a storm of disinformation. And of course, Taiwan is no exception. And we has been a lot of disinformation, in Taiwan's election. And regarding this report, Sorry, I have to miss this phone call. Sorry. And according this report, we find this year's election has several characteristics compared to the last one 4 years ago. First, disinformation attacks from foreign forces continue on this island. It is more difficult to detect and have involved methods, including new technologies. The second point is that the increasing number of AI disinformation, which was not seen in the last election, poses a serious challenge to decipher it. And the third point is that China-funded platform TikTok and Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, attracted a lot of users and had growing influence on people's communication and discussion regarding public affairs. So in our report, we find 3 categories of AI-related disinformation. The first category is AI-fabricated content. Regarding AI-generated content spans images, videos, and songs. And the AI-generated fake audios and videos that appear in the election mainly targeted on politicians and their private lives. And the second is coordinated behavior. And coordinated behavior requires a lot of fake account and the AI techniques to distribute fake news in a short time to a lot of audience. And the third category is misleading narratives, which include such as cross-strait relationship between Taiwan and China, and suspicions on the United States, and also sometimes criticize on the government doing. So these are the 3 categories we find in our report.
Thank you so much, Chen-Ling. I think one of the things that struck me from the report, and the report is available on our website, by the way, is when you mentioned fabricated content, it was the level of fabrication, essentially taking bits of fact and bits of fiction and weaving these 2 threads together using generative AI that made verification specifically difficult. And I want to bring in Rasto here to talk about the deepfake audio that you saw in Slovakia last year during the parliamentary election. Can you just briefly tell us how that worked and how that was targeted?
Thank you very much. First of all, also an honor for me to be with such distinguished speakers today. Yes, this was something which indeed was visible for the first time in Slovakia, such a deepfake audio. But maybe let me tell you that it was just the tip of the iceberg. And it was actually, we saw a campaign which was building up to this event. And I just want to mention for the context, maybe a couple of figures. In 2022, the World's Value Survey found that 59% of Slovaks actually had confidence in elections. Fast forward a few months later, and in late February 2023, an ultra-right politician circulated a video on Facebook saying that the elections would be manipulated. 2 months after this, in April 2023, approximately 50% of Slovaks actually feared that the elections would be manipulated. And I mention it because, deepfake on its own wouldn't actually have such impact, and maybe we can speak about the impact a little bit later. But I just wanted to bring the issue of trust, and I think this is super important. And maybe just to say now a couple of words about the deepfake audio. So what is important to remember, and I already mentioned it briefly, it was circulated on 28th September, and the election day was 30th of September. So this was the moratorium. The actual deepfake was an alleged phone conversation between the leader of the opposition party and one of the most prominent journalists, and they were allegedly discussing manipulating the Roma votes during elections. It had a viral potential. It entered the Slovak ecosystem through Telegram, and it was a Telegram channel which is supposed to be linked to the former head of the Supreme Court and also a candidate in the recent presidential election. And I will tell you a little bit later why I mention this politician. There was a very good reaction. I think the Ministry of Interior, the police, fact checkers, media regulator, I think really did excellent job to contain the message, but it still potentially reached 100,000 people. Maybe last point, and I guess we can discuss it a little bit further. I think the main aim, in my view, was actually not to somehow make people vote for someone or against someone, but rather to mobilize. I think, and I mention it because I mentioned the issue of trust and the fact that we had these manipulative narratives being circulated since February about the potential that the election will be manipulated. So, but I'm happy to speak about this in more detail in the next round of questions.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Rasto. So we've heard the Taiwanese perspective, and we've heard from Slovakia. Jiore, with your kind of global hat on, and you've got a lot of experience on different continents, how much have we seen, and how do you think generative AI is changing this landscape?
Thank you, Caro, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm honored also to be joining the panelists today. We've seen this in a lot of different country contexts. So from Pakistan to the UK, to the US, to Slovakia, to other parts of the world. We are seeing it used in a... Oh, I'm having some feedback.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Do you all have the feedback also? I think it's, Caro, perhaps, I think it's coming from your computer, perhaps, but let's, yes, okay. I think better. So we're seeing it in all different country contexts. We've also seen it outside of the election context in places like Sudan to sort of promote the aims of people engaging in the civil war there. And overall, I think what it mostly is doing is taking an online threat landscape that was already bad in the context of information threats, and it is making a lot of those things worse. In many ways, the fact that our lives are sort of governed right now by speed, impulsivity, disconnection, just because of how we are spending time online and how we are getting our information, AI takes advantage of those dynamics. So in each country context, we are seeing that sort of impulsivity and that move towards speed and away from depth of information, and an overall disconnection, especially coming out of the pandemic, that makes it really easy for a bad actor to use AI-generated information, whether it's to impersonate or whether it's to do something else, to sneak past people's critical thinking and slip them information that leads them astray.
That's really interesting. I want to come on to media, where media intersects with this bad information, disinformation within the kind of election cycle. And Chen-Ling, one of the other reasons we were very interested to look at Taiwan is because Taiwan has a very developed fact-checking network, a very developed media market, 18 rolling news channels, very tech-savvy population, who's, of course, very used to dealing tech-savvy media and population, and a media that's also very used to dealing with disinformation coming from China. So how did Taiwanese media cope in the January election with disinformation that was enhanced, if I can use that term, by generative AI?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Taiwan is very special media market because it's very, competitive and highly dense market. We have 24 hours news channel, but at the same time, we have the Broadcasting Television Act. So in general, the media, the televisions, they have to follow the rule and the high standard of professionalism and verifying the truth before they broadcast the news stories. And in our report, actually, we interviewed 5 media outlets, including public media and commercial media. We find a little bit differences between these two systems. For our public media, of course, they have very high standard, and they have to gain trust, among our citizens. For commercial media, of course, they have the, journalistic standards, but they face the market competition, and they also compared with online media. So that made the difference. And also, they lack the resources and the skills and the talent to deal with AI disinformation. So that's a really big challenge for our traditional media. So, but the first thing is that they tend to ignore or not to broadcast the AI disinformation if they are not able to verify the truth before, they really broadcast it. But at the same time, we suggest that traditional media should ask help from other organizations, such as fact-checking organizations, to help to verify the truth. And currently, we don't think the traditional media, they are really ready for, verified AI disinformation.
Thank you, Chen-Ling. One of the things that struck me in the report was a specific example. I think it was a deep fake very early on in the election campaign that was quite complicated to debunk. And you had media, you had fact checkers, and this whole network of people. But essentially, it almost took 7 days for a definitive answer to come out. And it just struck me that is really lost time. That's golden time when conspiracy theories flourish, because people don't really know what's real and what's out there. In what's out there. And that brings me to Jiore. And I'm curious from your perspective to understand, what is it about the nature of disinfo, especially when it's kind of enhanced by generative AI, that makes it a challenge for media to deal with?
Right.
Sorry.
No. First.
No worries. So we're hearing a lot about generative AI threats, and people are talking about either deepfake audio or deepfake images or voice cloning, or really the use of all of those things to create a different reality. But I am putting things in sort of 4 threat buckets that are helping me steer what to worry about and what to think about. The first is the one we hear the most about, which is just very sophisticated impersonation and deception. That's sort of the most commonly used example. And when it comes to impersonation and deception, often what you are fact checking is the messenger itself, the person who's communicating the information. And we already had a lot of challenge getting to attribution with things online, because we don't have the data access we would need to fully understand who is putting information into our news feeds, who's paying for that information, how they were organized to do that. We've seen in the recent discovery of a Russian propaganda outlet in the EU that they had to work with intelligence agencies to really be able to make the determination that there were payments being made to get that to a place where they could attribute it to a Russian backed operation. So impersonation is challenging, especially because of attribution. Then there's the bucket of satire, we're seeing a lot of AI-generated satire, and satire, for reasons I'm sure many will understand, is complicated to fact check, or it's a question of whether it should be fact checked. I mean, satire and humor is very important to sort of the function of a democracy, and so that enters a whole other area where both platforms, fact checkers, media, and voters have to decipher whether this is something to be taken lightly or if this is actually slipping in some deceptive information. Then there is the category that the other panelists have mentioned as well, which is really AI-generated threats or information threats or disinformation that is specifically about a flashpoint in time, a current event, and takes advantage of speed or the timeline or the time horizon till an event occurs. So I suspect we will see more risky disinformation targeting voters in the weeks or days leading up to an election period, where there is not as much time to counter that information, and there's not as much time to collect the information you would need to make the compelling case. And then finally, I've referred to this, but both detection and determining that something is authentic are adding to the challenge of all this. A lot of what we hear about is audio and video, but there's also really personalized efforts that are coming in the form of text messages that are showing up in encrypted spaces on people's personal devices, making it very challenging for anyone to really detect that unless they're getting flags in, unless those people know to flag it as deceptive, and they're increasingly personal, they're using personal details. And so getting to detection, getting to the full scale of detection, both to do it comprehensively and to do it in time is very challenging. And then once you've detected something, in many democracies, there is not a central election authority, or there is not a trusted central election authority. In some democracies, we do have that. But if you even just take the specific concern of disinformation regarding election processes and voting, and actually, the steps you would need to take to cast your ballot, we don't even have a way for central election authorities to say that they are going to be proving it's them in a comprehensive way. So 2024, we won't have the safeguards in place that we would need and that we will hopefully have in the future for sure. And so it's going to be on a lot of us to be proactively engaging in a constant dialogue with each other about what to do given this threat.
Jiore, one follow-up. What do you mean by takes advantage of speed?
So with the 24-hour news cycle and the incentives that media have, but many people publishing in a public forum have to be responsive to the pace at which disinformation and information is moving, all of those incentives are at odds with doing the kind of deep investigation you would need to do often to get to a place where you can attribute a disinformation threat to a certain actor, where you could reveal some of the systems behind the threat. I often talk about how the content of disinformation and just the importance of fact checking has sometimes led us astray or kept us distracted from all the background systems that exist at the social media companies and that have to exist in order for that disinformation to thrive on the platforms. So I mean mostly that in an age where there are so many incentives to go fast, it's easy to put information out there and be rather assured that you won't have people with the time to go deep on what you're doing and counter your claim.
Got it. Kind of a time-related segue, Rasto. I think what's interesting about last year's Slovakian election, but also the disinformation that you've just had in the presidential election, was the fact that some of this was targeted in the blackout and in the moratorium time period, which is rather ironic because I presume these were devices essentially set up ages ago to protect the democratic process in the time before people go to vote. But it seems to me in the Slovakian context, what you've seen is that these are now outdated.
Absolutely, and I think I would just come back to what was said before. I completely agree that time is actually of essence, but the ability to sort of react is also important, particularly from the side of traditional media, because if traditional media, specifically during the 48 hours blackout period, are unable to do so, then we are left with the dubious sources that usually are the vectors of spreading this type of disinformation. Now, the moratorium has clearly, is clearly outdated. It was designed, as you pointed out, in a completely different information age, when the main reason was actually that during the time when television was the main and usually the only source of information, people perhaps needed some time to reflect on what they saw. And so we had these 48 or 24 hours of moratorium. Nowadays, it's clearly pointless. I think, here I would refer to US, where such moratorium never existed because it would be against the Article 4, against the freedom of expression. And I think we should align our laws accordingly. I think what we see is that, from many studies and from research, we see that politicians are those main vectors of disinformation. And it's also very effective when politicians are spreading disinformation. And this is exactly the case here in Slovakia. So 2023, it was a deepfake audio. It was circulated, as I said, by the former or by Telegram channels which are possibly aligned with the former head of the Supreme Court, but certainly a politician. During these elections, we also saw different, events during the moratorium. But I think the main aim was really to do like last minute mobilization. I see a question from Anne Karin. She's asking, the aim was to mobilize in what way? Certainly, this poor quality deepfake audio would not be able to perhaps make some political converts, and then if you follow the way how it was circulated, it started and it was mainly circulated through the supporters, the Facebook groups of the current ruling coalition parties. And so this is what leads me to believe that this was an attempt to mobilize at the very on the eve of elections, make sure that you come, you see what is happening, and I think the narratives about elections being possibly manipulated is the same type of attempt, to not to make a convert. You are not going to vote for some different party based on this, but it could really help to mobilize. And we saw in the presidential election we had a record high turnout, over 61%. And I think this is due to this ability of politicians to mobilize. Unfortunately, for the ruling coalition, this was mobilization based on fear from war. What did not work, let's say, in Czech Republic, but worked in Hungary, also worked in Slovakia.
Thank you. So how worried should we be about democracies when this stuff is going on? Chen-Ling, what can other democracies learn from the Taiwanese experience and from your report?
Thank you. In spite of disinformation attack from China, the result of the election showed that the Taiwanese people's will not to, support the political parties, for China. So there must be something done rightly for, on our side. So the lessons learned from Taiwan, including the following principles. First, to prepare well and prepare as early as possible. For example, in Taiwan, it requires legislation to address the dangers of AI disinformation. So in year 2023, Taiwanese government made law amendment regarding on the Presidential Election Act regarding deepfake disinformation. So that's the first point. The second is to develop technical tools to combat AI disinformation. For example, we have some research institute which invested to, develop techniques to solve AI disinformation. But I don't think it's enough, so we have to invest more. And the third point is that it demands cross-sector cooperation to fight against disinformation, because it's a very complicated issue, and we have to, we need the cooperation between the government and the traditional media, and also the digital platform and the civil societies. So we have to work together. For example, the government has to communicate with the digital platform to deal with AI disinformation, and also the media, because they lack of the skills. So they have to work with citizen organizations, especially the fact-checking organizations. And I think the last point that it requires international community to learn and to expand international cooperation. For example, the fact-checking organization in Taiwan, they are the, they are of the Alliance of International Fact-Checking Network. So it helps us to develop our skills and strengthen, our ability to fight against AI disinformation.
Thank you, Chen-Ling, and we'll get to what needs to be done in a moment again. But I want to ask Jiore, and just following up on what Chen-Ling was saying, there are some studies and some researchers who believe that the fears over disinformation is overblown. Should we look at the role of generative AI and how it could supercharge disinformation as a threat to democracy?
Well, information, high quality information, is vital for a functioning democracy. But we also know that in the history of democracy, there have been people spreading propaganda and lies in other formats. It's not new. What is new is the information landscape we find ourselves in, which is how information is reaching people. And what we are finding, and what makes the Taiwanese situation really unique, is the trusted messengers that media can be or not be in a country. And that is, after earning the trust of an audience over time, having a relationship with them, sort of making it known why you should be trusted. And I would say if we look at different democracies around the world, the level of trust in media, in the people who would traditionally be putting out information, fact-based information, is really varied and in some cases very low. And I think that is the really scary component of the information environment that we're in right now, that makes it different from when we've seen propaganda and disinformation in other formats. I alluded to this earlier, but one thing that I think is missed, because I absolutely agree that this threat can be used to mobilize people, I also think that our overall environment that we're in terms of how we're consuming information, especially when we're consuming it in a passive way and we're having it come in from all different sides, I think there's a risk that, as bad actors aim to break down our trust, it makes us sort of overall insecure. And when we're insecure, we are emotional. And when we're emotional for a long time, we're tired. And then when we're tired, we're very easy to control. And I worry about both the short-term, short horizon AI-generated disinformation threats, and I also worry about the sort of always-on, steady stream of disinformation that is eroding our trust, that is sort of pushing us into a disengaged place. And I think that this year, one of the messages I'm communicating is that people should make sure that the information they're receiving is not leading them to disengage in their democracy, and sort of make information earn the right to get you to take a decision about how you participate, and really keeping the message on participation and engaging, because I fear, and having worked in places where that sort of suppression effect is very effective. I think there's really no democracy, no matter how advanced it is, or no matter what the media ecosystem, that's entirely immune to that, because it's not only about the bad actors engaging in an election, it's also about the way our screens are sort of governing our time.
I think that's really fascinating, because on the one hand, you've got Rasto's point about mobilization, but on the other end of it, you've got disengaging in democracy, and these things seems to me equally of danger and value. Rasto, the deepfake in last year's Slovakian election, did it change the outcome?
So, but let me maybe first just agree with Jiore and perhaps add that absolutely, mobilization was present, but I would just point out that mobilizing based on fear is actually not a good mobilization. So I think this actually contributes to what I think she was describing about those potential threats to democracy. And I think this really just comes from the main reason of disinformation is really to kill activism. And so I completely agree with that. And I also feel that on the other side we need to keep mobilizing people, but definitely not on negative, but rather positive messages. I think the impact, it's always difficult to measure the impact. That's why I tried to provide the full context. And the context there was that it was just the tip of the iceberg, and there were many more such efforts, long-term efforts, to actually undermine the integrity of elections. And let me just maybe make one more point here. What we have seen maybe since 2016 is that there are two different type of groups of actors who are actually spreading this type of content. Initially, these were external actors, external meaning countries that try to meddle into someone else's elections, such as Russia, China, and others. More and more we see internal actors actually utilizing disinformation for their political purposes. At the end of the day, what I think is the bad result is the fact that integrity of elections is in question. And this is what we saw again. For example, in the US elections, when these manipulative narratives started circulating 1 year before elections, by Trump, saying that there may be manipulations through the postal vote, and then leading up to the after election situation when he did not recognize the elections. And I think this is another angle of that problem. In our case, coming back to your question, I don't think I'm in a position to say, whether it changed the outcome of elections, but certainly I think it's fair to say that disinformation in 2023 as well as in 2024 played an important role. And again, unfortunately, here, instead of politicians playing the more constructive role, understanding the threat, as it was done in many other countries, anticipating, preparing, monitoring, public awareness campaigns, pre-banking, inoculating the public against this, which I think is the only way to go. Instead, they are actually using disinformation for their political purposes, and therefore polarizing societies and sort of creating the atmosphere where polarization, fear, and lack of trust are present.
Thank you, Rasto. I want to go on to what needs to be done, and this kind of plays into some of the questions that we are getting at the moment. Chen-Ling, how important is what the Taiwanese government is trying to do to tackle the problem in your country?
Yeah, the government has applied several strategies to deal with AI disinformation, especially attack from China. And first thing is law enforcement. And the second thing is to respond to disinformation quickly. It means transparency and open information system. And the third thing is to work with the civil society. And the first thing I don't think the government is so far has done enough is that the media environment, of Taiwan is quite different from the European country because our public media is quite small and it don't have much influence on the public. So that made our general public very weak, for disinformation attack. So that's one more thing I think that the government should do.
Thank you. Jiore, platforms, really social media platforms. Actually, this is for you and Rasto. They sit at the heart of this. What do they need to do?
Right. Well, the platforms are in a unique position, given there's only a handful of them and they govern so many billions of us. And we've already seen them roll back, in some cases, the trust and safety teams and the systems they've had in place in previous election periods to protect voters. So we always are hopeful that the social media companies will put safeguards in place because they can slow the speed of information moving. They can uniquely check and look at where different attempts to put information into the ecosystem are coming from. They can also be far more transparent. And I would argue that data access for independent researchers is maybe the number one priority on my list about what would help this year, because in the past, so much of what has been found and caught was in fact found and caught by independent researchers who had access. And we've seen tools get rolled back and access get rolled back in the lead up to this year. One could argue to not have that scrutiny that they've had in the past, although I can't verify that that's their aim. It's just something I suspect. And then we are also seeing that whether or not they want to proactively put safeguards in place, in some places, like in Europe, you have the first enforcement period of the Digital Services Act, which is new legislation that approaches digital policy in a new way, in a systems-based way, over just a content-based approach to policy. And this enforcement period will cover the lead up to the European Parliament elections. So in that case, we may see platforms make choices to either avoid regulation, or we may see them face regulation or face enforcement and accountability after the election period as a result of what goes on or doesn't go on in the lead up to June. I often remark that even in my own career, I was not focused enough on the social media platform's role because in many ways they are invisible. The way that their systems are interacting with these disinformation threats are really not plain to see. And so we have to work harder to make them to call for them to share information about what is leading to something showing up in our news feeds. And I think especially when you have encrypted spaces and you have spaces that are largely ungoverned, like, for example, Telegram, there are additional challenges that we need to sort of be engaged in real time, because there is not a standard for policy that should make that problem better yet. We don't have one. So I'd like to see more conversations looking at that and more pressure for platforms to either proactively or because they have to put safeguards in place.
Rasto, just before we come to you, Jiore, we've got a question from Adolf, who's a journalist in Uganda, a place where we've also worked. So it's great to hear from you. And his question is about significant proportion of young people in Uganda between 15 and 24, also vulnerable to disinformation, people who have, of course, get information via their mobile devices. And you've just talked about what you think the technology giant should be doing. But his question is also about how young people can take advantage of this new era of generative AI, especially when they are consuming information. Jiore, do you want to come in on that, or possibly Chen-Ling after that?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to it. I feel very passionate about the role of young people in this conversation overall. Young people as digital natives naturally see the information environment online in particular in a different way. They have, in some cases, an enhanced sense of what is real and what is not in every case. And so I would, I don't know to the degree that young people are on this call, but to the degree there are people who mentor young people on this call, I would encourage mentors to really work to build young people into a place where they feel confident enough to contribute to the conversation about what the future should look like. I think that with the introduction of social media in 2012, 2013, 2014, it was a lot of young folks who were actually ending up in conversations telling people what was needing to be done in terms of safeguards, in terms of what threats existed. And I think that we've seen in places like Poland, young people can really make all the difference in their own organizing, often online organizing, regardless of whether they have the support of their government, to shift outcomes that have huge bearings on democracy. So I would, to the point about how should they specifically take advantage of the new era of AI, they should keep doing what they've done, and they should feel empowered and find mentors who can bring them into the rooms and have them get a seat at the table that they'd need to have to contribute to the conversation in a way that people will take to heart.
Thank you. Rasto, did you want to follow up on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not young any longer, but I still consider myself to be a tech enthusiast. And we should not forget, I mean, today we are actually focusing on the negative side, but any technology can be used for good and also for bad purposes. And so I think we should always remember these. And I'm also optimistic that I think we will figure out ways how to handle this. I could not agree more about what George just said about the young people. I think yes, exactly. Polish elections, 70% of first and second time voters actually came and voted, and then also I would add women, 79%. So I think this is super important. When it comes to the platforms, I actually have to also agree that. It appears that instead of doing more, they are actually doing less to prevent the amplification of authoritarian voices from dominating the public discourse, from confusing the public, undermining the concept of knowable truth, and bending the narrative to their and their allies' favor. So I think this is worrying. Exactly, some teams at these platforms were dismantled. We benefited, my organization, Memo 98, from access to CrowdAngle by Meta. And of course, we are very worried what will happen after August 2024 when Meta is supposed to stop the availability of this tool. And it has been absolutely crucial for us to research and then again, like I also completely agree with the point on transparency. I think this is super important because we live in the age where we will not have problem with the lack of information, but the exact opposite, with too much information, and we just need to figure out the way how to navigate and having better access, having more transparency, understanding, how these algorithms actually work. I think this will be crucial for future.
Thank you, Rasto. We've got 3 questions from people listening in. All 3 have got to do with tools being used by media organizations. Rowan Philp asking about beyond debunking in Taiwan, specifically Chen-Ling, what kind of tools were most effective in trying to find out who was behind the disinformation? For example, CrowdTangle that Rasto just spoke about, reverse image search. There's another question from Naomi Goldsmith asking about what help what's the best way to help media professionals? And I think tools also play a role in that. Would our panelists want to talk a bit about this? What's effective? Do you want to start on that, Chen-Ling, if you know from your experience in Taiwan?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, when we talk about the AI, it's about the technology. Yeah, actually, I agree with Rasto that technology should be neutral. The outcome just depends on how we use it. And for AI disinformation and the debunking, in our research, we find that there are two approaches of citizen organization when they try to deal with AI disinformation. The one approach is to debunk the content itself, and the second is to try to use AI technology to trace the source and the root of disinformation. So it's maybe, kind of answer the first question. Yes. And for example, in Taiwan, we have the organizations such as Taiwan AI Left. They are trying to develop and use AI technology to deal with the problem, the same technology produced, in our information ecosystem. And the second, for the media professional, just as I mentioned that, of course, we have to invest more. But currently, because of the market competition and also, to compare with online platform for the time issue. So it is more efficient, to work with the organization or research institute to apply AI technology to try to solve the problem. And I think, again, it's require the multi stakeholders to work together.
Thank you. Rasto, Jiore, do you want to come in here?
Sure, and I follow also the questions, by the participants. Thank you very much. There is one about, what could be done, or whether US, UK, and EU cooperation on fighting disinformation could help in the light of upcoming elections. I think it's absolutely essential. I think this problem is such a multi-stakeholder problem, so it really requires this type of cooperation. From my side, I've seen slightly different approaches when it comes to the approach of US, which has been rather hesitant to start with more regulation, which initially really wanted to leave it up to the platforms, up to the market. Perhaps Jiore can comment on that. And the EU and also UK, where I think it's clear that there was a decision that it's impossible to leave it up to the platforms any longer. And therefore, and Jiore mentioned already DSA, DMA, GDPR, and other efforts, to try to regulate. I initially was in that first group as someone who has worked a long time, sort of supporting freedom of expression, but over years, I just simply came to the conclusion that no, we actually do need some regulations, and again, this cooperation among these different countries is absolutely crucial, because that's the only thing that actually can work with these big platforms. I mean, they would not pay attention to a small country like Slovakia if it were not for the EU and the sort of joint approach. I mean, by the EU countries, and of course we can talk more about this, and maybe just very quickly, I will also take the specific question about the concrete tool, which was I think Junkipedia. I think it doesn't really matter if it's CrowdTangle, if it's meta content library. whatever it will be at the end. I think what matters for researchers is that we do have good access to data. I think on our side, we also realize that we need to be vetted, that in the light of Cambridge Analytica, we should not presume that everyone should have access, particularly to private accounts. But something that CrowdAngle provided was access to public accounts, public groups. And I think this is something that we still need.
I agree. I will say, just as a short point, for those of you who are not already using the free CrowdTangle link checker, which is an extension, not just the CrowdTangle content library, it's going away in August. I'm very sad about that. It was an amazing tool, one of the only tools we had that really did help with attribution. So I would install that plugin if you still can, and do what you can until then to look at attribution of some of any online property or any online news source that you're unsure about. I would do some investigation before August with that very free plugin. I wanted to address a question that is in the chat that I also wrote a written answer to about the free speech. About the free speech point which Rasto just mentioned. I do not think that social media is a free speech environment. I think that an assertion that social media is a free speech environment is actually a distraction from getting us to a place where we're looking at the fact that the platforms have their thumb on the scale. It is a curated speech environment. What is showing up in our feeds, where we post and how we post is governed and determined by their business interest, not by our right to express ourselves freely. And so when you look at how the platforms actually have been showing up in court cases in the US recently, they've 180'd and completely turned around on their previous position that was they are just a space that information moves through, and they cannot be held liable for anything that happens on their platform. They've now switched their position, and they've said that because actually they're more like a newspaper editorial board, they need free speech protection to be able to make whatever choices they want about what we see in our feeds. So I like to bring that in because I agree. I think free speech is extremely important, and especially in cases where you have the government interacting with information in ways that threatens free speech, we have to be super careful about how we put policy in place that gives government powers to check the platforms and gives the platforms power to collude with government. And we have to be very careful. And I think it's worth repeating because this is something that costs us no money to just make the point on and would actually shift the conversation quite a bit. It's worth repeating that our existing status quo place is not one where we have free speech on the platforms and where we are, completely in control over our time online. So I do think that if there was a way for there to be a, online space that was truly neutral, and perhaps was neutral and based on, sort of open source principles, I do think that could be an interesting town square concept. I don't see how we arrive there. I don't see how a business would find that a viable model. And I don't think that we have the trust with institutions to really move to that place. I'm hopeful someone will think of it one day. Perhaps that's what the young people will do for us. But right now, I don't think it's possible.
Thank you so much. I think we've basically covered all the questions, which is brilliant because we've got 2 minutes left. Finally, I want to mention one thing, and it's regarding the question in the chat about what journalists can do and what tools they can use and what works and what doesn't. And I would urge young journalists, especially people who are starting out in their careers or covering elections for the first time, or maybe not even for the first time, to look at resources that are available. Some of my colleagues have done a brilliant training course, Rethinking Disinformation, which looks at the whole concept of pre-bunking. And they've got some really fantastic academics and journalists that teach about this notion. So if you're interested to understand not only what technical tools you can use, but also speaking to what Jiore mentioned before, the psychology of some of this and how it influences you as the journalist and as the media professional between the electorate and where the information is coming from. Please use resources like that. Rethinking Disinformation. It's on Journalism Now, our platform. I would like to thank our panelists, Professor Chen-Ling Hung, and Chen-Ling, has been great collaborating with you on this report and learning from the Taiwanese experience. Thank you so much, Jiore, for joining us very early where you are. And I know you've got travel behind you and travel coming up around these topics, and very valuable work. And of course, Rasto's joined us from Bratislava, and Slovakia is an area where we work. We like to work there. We support the cause of independent, trusted journalism in your part of the world, where it's not always easy to commit that kind of journalism with Russia on your doorstep. Thank you so much to all of you who joined, and thank you for everyone who listened in to this webinar and gave us your thoughts via the Q&A. This webinar will be made available on YouTube in the days to come. So follow us on social media and on LinkedIn, and then you can recommend it to friends if they want to catch up on this important topic. Thank you so much from all of us at Thomson. Goodbye.